Yahtzee is the game we play.
I have so many Yahtzee things to show you.
Pick up the dice.
Oh, you'll be sorry.
It's time to roll for our pleasure.
Have you played Hungry, Hungry Hippos? We lie in between this realm and the game of life.
In the netherworld, all is but a mousetrap.
You haven't the slightest clue.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Are they in the proper approach pattern for today?
Negative.
Hold weapons! Now! Charge the lightning field!
Things that make you go, oh.
Tim Allen, get the hell out of here. Get!
Yeah, it's not Christmas time yet.
I can't reduce your sentence, you dick.
There's no horror clause here.
All right, well. The day the music died.
Let's dig this grave. I'm going to hop right in. But we're going to be talking about comic books because we're a geek and nerdy podcast.
Who know a lot about comic books.
We know a lot about comic books, and we know a lot about horror. So let's combine the two and tell you about
The Magazine Red Book.
horror comic books.
Oh, no, you're right.
Ladies' health, men's health.
I was done with this Red Book before I saw it.
Go back inside. We're potting.
Having fun over there in Pizza Land?
Let me get my iron. So, horror comics, everybody.
Yeah.
It's Halloween times. Let's get all spooktified. Eh?
Nope.
Uh,
Deflates physically.
So horror comics have essentially been around since very early on in comicdom. The roots generally come from the World War II era in the 40s.
And
when you had
Questlove.
stuff. And Questlove, he was there. He was putting out some awesome horror stuff.
Some sweet jams.
Ernie Chan was drawing.
Jurassic 5 tried to tag along, and everybody was like, get the fuck out, man. Don't tell them where we're going.
Yeah. Go with Wally Wood and do some fucking Western comics, assholes.
Where's Q-Tip? Have you seen Q-Tip? No? Oh, he's on the front.
He's just vibing out there, man.
He's the tip of the spear.
Yeah, there's always going to be problems. This city's full of problems.
Ghouls and goblins.
That's a dangerous path to walk.
That is a tribe called Pointless.
But in the 40s, you had a lot of crime comics that were coming out. You're like thrilling crime, crime does not pay, stuff like that.
There's thrilling and then kind of mediocre crime.
Crosswalk crime.
Starting the Crosswalk Commandos.
There's Hey You Jaywalker. That was a good title. They would often put in supernatural elements or dark, macabre elements that kind of veer toward the horror side. And then about 1943, you had the Classics comics where they, if you guys don't know what Classic Comics is, they would take classic stories like a Moby Dick or Robin Hood, things like that, and turn them into a comic book story.
Right, as seen in the movie Major League.
Really? Classic comics are in that?
Don't you remember?
No, I don't.
With Rene Russo and the Substitute. He was the singing cowboy in Russell's Rhapsody. He played the catcher.
I don't know. Just
fine, doesn't matter. So the whole thing was
he
that
in The Principal or The Substitute?
I just said that.
Well, I wasn't listening to you. I was reading.
That was the first one I said before Treat Williams took over. Yeah,
Pre-Treat. Tom Berenger?
Tom Berenger. Thank you very much. He used to hang out at the bar that I worked at. So when Tom Berenger's character was trying to get back together with Rene Russo, she talked about how uncultured he was, and she was like, well, have you ever read Moby Dick? So then he goes and he finds the Classics comic book version.
Oh.
And then he goes and tries to make references to it later or whatever.
Huh.
Yeah.
I didn't remember that.
Long road for that, but it's there.
Yeah. We got there in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So Classics Comics number 13, they tell the story of Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is generally considered the first dedicated horror comic.
And by that, you mean in the format of what we consider comic books, because there were a lot of like Penny Dreadfuls and stuff that...
Correct.
Right,
Yes.
okay. Making sure. Oh, yeah.
And the modern idea of comic books.
Right. Modern format as far as size and balance of text and imagery and all that. Yeah, okay.
Indeed. Along with crime comics, horror comics really started to take off in the 40s. Again, you had these wars going on. There was a lot of danger that people were experiencing. So this served as an escape for them to experience these horrors, these supernatural dangers, but at a relatively safe distance, and were able to relieve some of their anxiety and dread.
That's why baseball was a big thing during World War II. It was something that was consistent and also constant and was not involved in the war. That's why they had a league of their own. That's why...
Yeah, no, totally. So there'd always been horror in comics. You know, even had Detective Comics in 1939. Batman was battling a vampire. Classic image. And then you had Frankenstein Adventures and whatnot. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Yes?
Oh, I just thought Frankenstein Adventures just made me think of like young Indiana Jones. It was like young, not young Frankenstein, but little kid Frankenstein Adventures, you know? James Bond Jr. type of shit.
It's just him throwing different children into rivers.
Ponds and then killing old blind men accidentally.
Somebody's got to.
Somebody's got to kill Gene Hackman.
We've been waiting. In 1947, Avon Publications released the first issue of Eerie Comics, featuring 6 original stories of the occult and supernatural, and one of the first covers that highlighted this like menace and the damsel in distress. Mm-hmm. You had other things published by EC Comics, like Adventures in the Unknown. There was a lot of combination of, you know, sci-fi space adventures and the horror elements there. By the 1950s, horror comics had really blown up. Following World War II, you had more anxieties in the world with the Cold War that was looming. And they used these horror comics to kind of, again, release some of that fear and dread. You get stuff like The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, which a lot of people might think of just as the TV show, but it did come from a comic book.
It actually has a longer history as a comic book.
100%. But I think it's a similar thing, I think, that will come about like in 20 years, where people will think of The Walking Dead and they won't think of it as a comic book.
Oh, yeah.
They will just think of it from the TV show because it's far surpassed the comic was.
Not in quality, but in length.
Yes. In reach, in
exposure,
social impact. Yeah. It's the amount of people who have read the comic to seen the show. It's minuscule.
So all those people like us who read the comic and thought it was great up to a certain point were so excited about the show coming out, and then now we're not fans because it sucks compared to the comic.
Let's be honest, nobody's a fan now. I mean, they can't draw any ratings. They've put too much out. They've strung everything out too long.
That's funny because I've seen like 5 different Walking Dead shows in the last, trailers for them in the last like week or two. It's like,
yeah, because those are all like things that were like greenlit and put in production, but the ratings have steadily declined. They're having trouble getting people excited about that show.
Because there's nothing new. It's all the same commentary, just in different settings.
Apparently there's new faster zombies in it, huh?
Oh,
that's
my
something
God.
to watch, right?
So that one thing you rebelled against, now you had to like lean into because you realized that you were living in a zero-sum game. Come on now, dude.
You got to freshen it up.
Oh my God. James Gunn was a prophet.
So, comic books are really doing super well. The horror ones specifically.
But these are also the ones that were hotly debated during the whole McCarthy.
Yes. Yeah, that's just what I was getting to. You had a generation that was voraciously reading these. Everybody was reading it from young to small. And then you had The Seduction of the Innocent.
Yeah. Episode 50. Go check it out.
Yes. We did a lot of research. We do voices on it. It's great.
It is great.
Lots of great stuff.
We did.
It's one of our best episodes.
Yeah, it is one of our.
Does that episode have a number?
50.
50.
That's why we did it, because it was the 50th. That's why we did it. Because we kept talking about it. We're going to do it someday, and we were like, nah, we're never going to do it. And it was like, well, shit, 50th episode's coming up. Got to do something.
That's about right.
Yeah, I'll figure it out.
So, by all means, go listen to that episode on the Citizen of Innocent. That'll explain all of the stuff that happened and leads us to the Comics Code in 1954, where many of those horror comic publishers canceled comics or vastly retooled their titles. DC Comics, about that time, evolved their House of Mystery and House of Secrets comics from horror to science fiction. You have Marvel Comics, which we'll kind of come to in a little bit, what they were doing.
Because they've got a whole big hand in this.
Yeah, they got a lot going on.
This is actually one of the renaissances of Marvel and how they well, I guess not renaissance because it's the beginning of Marvel, but this is one of the ways that they embedded themselves into modern pop culture, was that they not only put out superhero books, but also alternatively formatted horror comics as well. They were outside of the realm of the superhero genre.
Exactly. That's the same thing that Warren Publishing did. Because of the loophole within the Comics Code, they print out like bigger things. Theirs were in black and white and magazine format, which allowed things like Creepy and Eerie, two of the true classics in the horror comics genre, to sustain and keep putting out horror
or
comics,
or
gore, more mature elements, things that weren't toned down.
That's when they get rights to Conan at that point, and so you have those Conan magazines.
Yep. Frankenstein's Monster was one. You had Vampire Tales.
Wolfman. There was a Wolfman one, wasn't there?
It was Wolfman's Nards that was coming out.
That was he does have that. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you couldn't say that with the code. That's why you put it in a magazine. You can talk about his nards all day long.
But in that movie, you could drop the other F-bomb. Great.
It's a movie of its time, unfortunately.
But even then,
I would say its time. That's something that you would hear.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Yeah,
but it's also kind of like dropping the N-word back then. It was still wrong. They just did it. Which that Richard Pryor bit when he went to Africa and he's just like, wow, one of the greatest things about being in Africa is no one's called me the N-word yet. That was in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you get through the 50s, in the 60s, where there starts to become a bit more of a relaxation on the strictness of the code within the horror comics. You're starting to get a bit more of a resurgence. You're also having underground comics with an X. That culture is kind of bubbling up.
Damn you, Elon Musk! God damn it! Stop making
comics formerly known as Twitter.
Stop making X try to happen. Stop trying to make X happen. It's not going to work.
I just wish they would have called. I mean, Fetch is almost better.
It actually, that's also a different app, but
it is, yeah. Yeah. So during the 50s and 60s, that's kind of when Marvel's starting to do some of its stuff. So before the start of the Marvel Universe in 1961, Marvel Comics were then known as Atlas Comics in the 50s.
Well, you're forgetting about 1940s Marvel Comics #1, featuring the original Human Torch.
Yes, but it wasn't like Marvel Comics.
Right. I know,
I mean, that's where like this whole thing comes from, but
yeah, this is a longer story. The whole origin of that is a longer story.
But Atlas Comics was publishing lots of horror comics, and they were being created by some of the big ones. You know, your Kirby's, your Ditkos, and that Lee guy, whoever that dickhole is.
Jim Lee? Come on, lay off, man. Actually, I'm probably fine with that too. That's fine.
But instead of like the way that EC or Warren Publishing were putting out books, focused on dismemberment and truly occult horror things, you had stuff like Tales of Suspense and Amazing Fantasy, which were kind of more like a House of Mystery, which I think will
it's EC, here. But yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to that one.
Okay.
But they were kind of focusing more like monster-focused sci-fi horror elements, kind of more like a Twilight Zone or an Outer Limits. where you'd
but
have
really,
these.
but really, really lame. It's like Twilight Zone if written by children. Where it's like they have these ironic twists that are they ironic or are they even really? I mean, it's a twist, but it's kind of like stupid and obvious, you know?
Yeah, their focus on what we'd call like O. Henry storytelling was pretty on the nose and not really trying that much.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't you to redefine O. Henry?
I can do that. So, O. Henry style comes from O. Henry, also known as William Sidney Porter, who's called the father of modern American short stories, also known as the Encyclopedia of American Humor in the realm of world literature. His writing style was vivid and had a lot of irony and metaphor and exaggeration to make the story full of fun. Always had these surprise endings and usually designed story plots dramatically to make some changes unexpected at the end, which would always subvert the reader's expectations. It became kind of a trope to use. So O. Henry wrote something like The Gift of the Magi, The Cop and the Anthem, some of these classics. But like his use of a surprise ending, that's something like Tales from the Crypt. A perfect example of this would be something like the Twilight Zone episode To Serve Man, where this guy, these aliens have come down here on the ship, but it isn't till the end, where you're reading from this book, and you find out it's a cookbook on how to serve man.
Yeah, you really botched that twist.
I really did. Yeah. Do you want to take over and
no? It's kind of over now. But the idea was that it was like
the magic of editing. You can make it whatever you like.
There was time now. I made that reference yesterday, and Kate it was just right over her head, and I was like, Jake would laugh at that. Damn it.
That's good. Another classic one.
One of the best ones.
Yeah. That one I could probably break down. There's a bookworm who works in a bank, played by Burgess Meredith. Mm-hmm. He has all these books that he's, and all these people that he's dealing with constantly. And he's just like looking for a time to get away and read his book and not be bothered by everybody. A nuclear explosion happens. Everyone is killed. He's in the vault. He gets out. Finally, he has time to read these books without all these interruptions of life and
other people. Yeah.
And as he goes to pick up the book to read, he drops his thick glasses in the ground and they break and he is blind without them.
Yep. I mean, that's maybe the most iconic, ironic sci-fi horror short ever, right? I mean, isn't it?
It's definitely up there.
The quintessential.
I'd have to do some real brain thoughts there to.
I mean, you can go Gift of the Magi, sure. I understand that completely, but and yeah, right. I mean, this is living in the house that Gift of the Magi built, but in the modern sci-fi horror genre, that's kind of the story, Because even a lot of other Twilight Zone episodes are echoes of that. And strangely enough, I don't know what it is about Burgess Meredith. And I'm not even talking about the movie Stir Crazy with Goldie Hawn and Chevy Chase and Dudley Moore, but or even Rocky. But in Burgess Meredith's other Twilight Zone edition, do you remember that one? The one where he had that stopwatch that would stop time?
Yeah.
Well, he stopped time to just get ahead or whatever because he wanted to steal money or get money or whatever. And then he walked outside and the Soviet nuclear missiles were like right above the city.
Right. Yeah.
And he's just like, fuck. Like, I want those two characters to meet somewhere on a plane of reality.
Oh, if he could only stop time, but it always happened to be right after glasses have broken.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or the Holocaust that happens was because he restarted the watch, and then the bookworm comes out of the vault, and it doesn't matter. The bookworm was going to die of cancer anyway.
It's a shared universe, really.
Oh, it's the Twilight Zone
SVU.
They tried to make a movie, but then a guy died in a helicopter accident.
Sorry, I was right, but it happened to be these 4 toys that were in this drum.
Can you describe your assailants? Yeah, one of them was dressed as a band leader. One of them looked like a clown. There was a ballerina there. That's pretty good.
I'm being stalked, but it's by this tiny little UFO.
There's this book called To Serve Puss. No. There's this book there that's called To Serve Ass.
God. Oh, that's so crass. I love it.
Oh, good To Serve Crass. Yes, indeed. That is garbage. But very funny.
Bow to Lord Crass.
And all he surveys.
I feel like he should be on the ziggurat and with Rip Torn and Beastmaster.
Oh man, that sounds like the name of a rolling papers company. Ziggurat.
That'd be a kick-ass rolling papers company.
And the spokesman would 100% be Rip Torn.
I'm throwing these deals into the fire.
It just harkens back to that his arrest video. Are you going to bed up here?
But at the same time, you have these burgeoning superheroes that are coming out from
these
Marvel
Burgess
Comics.
Meredith superheroes.
These Burgess Meredith superheroes.
The Penguin,
without glasses and
whatnot.
broken time watches. They would be interacting with these horror elements as well. Like in Fantastic Four #1, you have them facing a giant monster coming out of the street.
Uh-huh.
The first appearance of Hank Pym
Coming straight out to Underground.
is from a
Fuck the
1962 is originally from a 1962 horror story, The Man in the Anthill, about shrinking technology and anthills and blah blah blah. Or you had characters like the dragon Fin Fang Foom, who was incorporated from those horror comics into the universe. Stuff like from Tales of Suspense and Tales to Astonish. That's where you get Iron Man and Thor.
Thor, yep. Amazing Fantasy had Spider-Man.
100%, yeah. And then you start having these other characters where they utilize the superhero trope to bring these horror elements in, but kind of subvert that. So something like the Incredible Hulk, where a man who turns into a Jekyll-like creature, this literal monster, hulking mass of aggravated flesh. At night, it's a way to like tell these monster horror stories, but in a different trapping to kind of avoid any scrutiny from the comics code.
Wasn't it also when Gog, wasn't that one of the early, like at the same time as Hulk, one of the big monster ones that were released as comic books and not as magazine or? Do you remember Gog? Do you remember that one?
I think I'm a Gogasaur.
Obviously, since you have to look it up, that's probably true.
Well, tell me about Gog then. The Gogite.
Well, I mean, I could tell you about Magog, or
I know you could. I know you're all about the Magog.
Oh, I'm all Magog. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm pure Magog right here,
dude.
Through and through.
You know how much Gog this guy is putting out?
Magog for life. I pour out some grog for Gog.
He's got a Gog head over here.
I'm just the Gog of the machine, man.
You got to rage against this Gog. But like you couldn't have things about like vampires or werewolves or equivalent concept. Otherwise, it would be edited out due to the Comic Code Authority. So you get around that by having like Sauron, the X-Men villain, who's what is like a pterodon?
Yeah.
Mutant human thing.
He's a pterodon for sure. It's
the vampire sucks out people's life force.
And then you had Morbius, who's half.
Then you got Morbius, who's the living vampire.
Right.
So that's
not
different,
undead,
right?
He's not living dead or undead. He is a human vampire. The Blade, who's half. Then you got. Vampire.
I mean, that's when you're getting into the 70s, and that's when the comics code loosens up. And you start getting like Mephisto, 1968. You get 71 as Morbius. You're having Werewolf by Night.
Yes.
And Tomb of Dracula.
Yes.
These classic horror characters being incorporated into the Marvel continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get your Blades and your zombies.
Hellstrom.
Yep.
Son of Satan.
Yeah, all of these horror things coming out. You know, the
Man Thing, which is
Darkhold,
sort of ripping off
Moon Knight,
Yeah.
Ghost Rider.
Oh yeah, still great.
Yeah, Man Thing, which came
Ripping
out
off
before
Swamp Thing.
Swamp Thing.
I know, but well, yeah, Doom Patrol came out before X-Men, but who do you think people are gonna who are gonna relate to more?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
it's just
it
like
is
just
what
like
it is.
everybody thinks about Flash Gordon, but Buck Rogers was first. That kind of thing.
Who's this Duck Dodgers guy you keep talking about?
Adam Strange?
That's pretty strange. So while they were doing that stuff over at Marvel, as the things kind of loosened up, Warren Publishing continued to dominate the landscape of horror comics with their creepy, eerie, and Vampirella titles. Again, these were done in black and white comics, and not comic size, but magazine size. You also had stuff like Sky Publishing, who had like Nightmare and Psycho and Scream, which tended to be considered on the extreme end of that loosening up horror genre. But then as you started getting to the 80s, a lot of factors kind of led into a decline in the popularity of horror comics. You have direct market distribution, and specialty stores in the 1980s allowed for better targeting of specific audience. As a result, publishers began to focus more on genres with larger, more dedicated fan bases and steered away from horror comics. They also steered away from like crime comics and westerns, and most of the resources kind of got diverted to superheroes and really took over everything. You also had some changes in politics and social structures at the time, which led people away from a lot of horror stuff there. But that didn't mean it wasn't coming out, or there wasn't a underground resurgence that would lead to modern horror comics that we have now. Horror comics have always been a vetting and a playground for upcoming comic book talent. This goes back to artists and writers of those Eries and Creepies and Vault of Horrors and House of Mysteries. But in the 80s into the 90s, you had what's known as the British invasion. And that's, in horror comics, really where they kind of grew up, flourished, and planted seeds of modern horror comics. Stuff like 2000 AD over in the UK. You had the Vertigo comics. And Vertigo comics were a mature comic imprint, started in 1993. And there is where you have stuff like Hellblazer, Sandman,
Characters of which did start in the mainstream superhero DCU and then branched off with more serious, because Swamp Thing, Hellblazer, Sandman,
yes.
all of
Swamp
this
Thing is pre-Vertigo, but
Animal Man.
with Alan Moore there, and then Animal Man was
Grant Morrison.
Vertigo title, and that's sorry.
It eventually was a Vertigo title. It started out as just a regular DC title, and then the original
Right.
Sandman run had Dr. Destiny in it, who was a Batman villain.
Yeah, I mean, they have Batman in it. They have Scarecrow in it. Vertigo was still a DC comic. It wasn't its own thing. That came about a little later. But you were having Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Warren Ellis, Mark Millar, Peter Milligan, Jamie Delano. It allowed, in the same way that you had specific artists in the 50s and 60s, you had writers and artists coming over and cutting their teeth on Mark Millar, Grant Morrison, and Alan Moore. They wrote Vampirella comics. These people grow up in comic books, expressing themselves in horror, give them a foothold that they would then go on to write other things, like Alan Moore does that early Swamp Thing stuff, and then he does From Hell. Or, years later, his Providence and Neonomicon stuff.
His Lovecraft stuff is good.
Yes, he does a lot of Lovecraft. I mean, essentially all he writes about now is sex, Lovecraft, and the combination of the two.
Yeah, and it gets a little old.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much fishman rape I can take in a comic.
That's fair.
So
Then you haven't watched the Boys TV show recently.
Neonomicon
Well, I know I've read a lot of that.
Blows it out of the water. But Vertigo Comics, its horror roots allowed for an expression of ideas and ways to tell stories that wasn't really around much before. You had an inkling as Swamp Thing and V for Vendetta and Dark Knight. But it was that Vertigo that lets people tell their own stories. Because of Vertigo, you get stuff like Dark Horse and Image Comics. They're getting true expression and expansion of what comics can be. You're not just relegated to your standard DC and Marvel superhero or horror stuff comes in and out of superhero stuff, but because of the Vertigo crime stories, the Vertigo horror stories, it allowed for a genesis for what comics have become and where the best stories have come.
Yeah, I would say true, but also the whole genesis of Dark Horse and Image, I think, are a little more complicated than that because it also has to do with a lot of the economics of the thing.
100%. 100%. But also they saw that people could tell. It was a proof of concept, I think, that I think you needed to have these other types of stories being told, the success of those stories that allowed for them to then bank on those and that possibility to start up these other companies and tell these other stories. The infusion and expression of horror within 80s and 90s comics led to the horror comics that we're getting today. There's a lot of really cool, interesting stuff out there. You have your Lock and Keys and what Hellboy became, even though Hellboy is a little more
modern stuff. That was like 20 years ago.
Something is Killing the Children.
Okay, there you go.
There, I mean, that's modern. A Nice House on the Lake.
Oh, what's the one? The Black Barn one. What's that?
Gideon Falls.
Gideon Falls. I love that whole thing.
Yeah, which is very much Stephen King.
But I also think it was kind of David Lynchy. But then you also have something that is a hot button issue for Jake and I both. Crossed by Garth Ennis.
There's Crossed. Crossed is of that era of Walking Dead and
Avatar Press stuff, yeah.
Avatar Press, which again is an outlet for your Garth Ennis's and your Warren Ellis's and your Alan Moore's to tell weird horror stories. So that's kind of horror comics in a nutshell. Now that we have a grasp, an idea of where horror comics came from, is there any current horror comics or recent stuff that you would suggest for readers who are looking for something a little spooky this season, something that really sink their fangs into and gives you a fright? Because I think
sitting on that one,
horror comics actually right off the dome.
Nice.
I feel like horror comics are always a tricky subject. It was always something I had a tough time recommending to people because it's tough to really get you on the edge of your seat a lot of times when you're reading a comic in that way. So a lot of stuff just never quite clicked for me, or it devolves into too much superhero, too much gore, grossness, where it's not about, in the same way like torture porn films aren't about horror and scaring. It's about, discomfort.
Shock.
Exactly. So I feel like it's tough to find really good horror comics. Do you have anything that you would suggest, Skip?
Man, I mean, I'm going to stick to the Gideon Falls thing. Everything that I've read coming out of that universe, especially the Black Barn stuff, I was in love with. I thought that was visceral and ethereal and dark and brooding. It felt like a modern day Dark City directed by David Lynch type of thing, I loved it because I like that kind of Beyond the Black Rainbow existential horror.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Which is great because like a lot of other stuff is just genre stuff that repeats itself. But that kind of thing is where you get into a lot of the fun playgrounds, like, the movie Mandy with Nick Cage, where you're dealing with a lot of hallucinogenic imagery or basically anything by David Lynch. Firewalk with Me, Mulholland Drive, that kind of thing. Even Blue Velvet. I understand why Crossed is a thing. It was going to happen eventually. I never want to read it again. I don't regret reading it, but I never want to read it again ever.
Yeah, thankfully, I don't think Crossed currently still comes out. I could recommend stuff like Nice House on the Lake, but I've already talked about how great that book is. One of the best the past couple years. There's a 3-issue story called The Closet by James Tynion. It's a mix of mundane, suburban, midlife crisis sadness with this horror underpinning.
So like
with
a good
child.
American Beauty.
Yeah, kind of like that. There's something called Fear Case that was done by Matt Kint, an X-Files-y kind of thing, but with a Necronomicon lament configuration kind of item that will drive people crazy and kill themselves. So like as these people are searching for this item, these investigating to try and find where this is before it kills the next victim. And then what
Interesting.
happens there.
I like that type of horror. Yeah, I'm into that.
Again, I think it's 4 issues long, short story. That's all it is. And I believe there was a story called Hairball. I want to say that was Matt Kint again. I think a Dark Horse. A little girl and her maybe evil cat who might be killing her family.
The anti-Calvin and Hobbes. I think that's pretty awesome, actually.
Yeah, that's really good. And I would also suggest if you're looking for kind of something in that adventure horror genre, long form storytelling with a world building, Something is Killing Children is a very good time, a quick and fun read. I would recommend that as well.
Cool. That is awesome.
All of that stuff is stuff that's come out in the past 2-3 years. 3 of those. Something's Killing Children is a long story, multiple volumes, spin-off series, getting more and more. I'm sure it'll get turned into a movie or TV show relatively soon. I can't imagine it's not already signed up. But those other 3 are very short, small-scale, indie horror things that are well worth your time. And it'll give you a little something different.
And if you're not looking for something completely modern, but you want to go back and read some stuff that has already come out, I mean, I don't know that I'm going to go out of my way to suggest Steve Niles' work, but he was kind of a foundational horror writer after the modern age in comics. He did 30 Days of Night with Ben Templesmith, and he actually did a pretty good X-Files arc, and he basically just tried to brand himself as sort of like the Mark Millar of horror comics, because he had a bunch of movies and TV shows made from his stuff as well that people don't remember. Like I didn't know there was a sequel to 30 Days of Night until like 3 days ago, and I watched it.
Oh yeah.
30 Days of Night, I was like, I've seen it, whatever. And I always confused it with After Dark, so I didn't bother. But I've read a lot of Steve Niles' stuff. Honestly, the best part about Steve Niles is Ben Templesmith, who does excellent work with other people, including Warren Ellis. What was it called? Not Fallen? Or no, that one he did that was $1.25. Remember that one?
You think of Fell?
Fell! God damn it.
Where it's essentially it's very Fincher-esque.
Yes.
Cop seeing these mundane horror things in this small city town.
But episodic. Like
Episodic, yeah.
Not an overarching.
I believe that is the book where it stopped coming out because Warren Ellis left the script in a taxi, and the taxi drove off, and he's like, well, I don't write things twice, so that's it. I'm done.
Fuck
Never
you
touching
all.
it again.
The
I could be mistaken. It might have been a different series, but I think that was the series.
No, that sounds about right, because it's going to be one of 2 things. It's going to be that or Planetary, and he eventually finished Planetary, so it's probably that.
Yeah.
Look into anything that Ben Templesmith is involved in, because it's going to be horror, and usually it's pretty good. He's going to be with Steve Niles or Warren Ellis or other very competent writers. So,
yeah, it's pretty. It is
pretty.
Good,
His work. If you watch the 30 Days of Night movies, either of them, all of their aesthetic is 100% based on Ben Templesmith's interpretation, which I always thought was kind of abstract. So putting it into reality was kind of weird. But I feel like if you were going to use Ben Templesmith as an inspiration, you should probably be more abstract as a film,
Yeah.
He's got a very sketchy, he uses gouache, I'm pretty sure. He's a very dynamic, sketchy artist. It's not polished at all. It's very, very raw. So
yeah, there was big studio production. I just don't think that was ever going to happen. But ideally, that would have been cool.
Yeah.
And hopefully we found this episode of our podcast to be cool and help you feed your horror fixation. Bloodlust, as the kids are saying. Please go out, check these comics out. You're going to have a great time. And while you're doing it, feel free to like, share, and subscribe this particular podcast so that others can hear the greatness we provide, or
The good news.
the good word, as it was. We hope you can rate us 5 severed heads on the podcast app of your choice. Ideally, Apple, the iTunes, the iStore, the iWhatever. That would be great.
The iRobot,
Feel free to follow us on social media.
the
Eventually
Italian.
We will tell you
the,
things. It will happen.
That's a
But
lie.
until then, we come out with more podcasts all the time. So look out for the next spooky adventure. And Skip, take us on home.
Please do everything that Jake asked you to do. On your knees! Please remember to... Please make sure you've cleaned up after yourself to some sort of reasonable degree. And...
On your knees.
On your knees. Don't move it, I tell you! Fucking pig! And...
Oink, oink.
More Nicolas Cage references. So don't forget to tip your waitstaff and bartenders and from Dispatch Ajax. Oh no, and don't forget to... I'm an idiot. Don't forget to support your local comic shops and retailers. And from Dispatch Ajax, we'd like to say Godspeed, fair wizards.
Oink, oink.
I'm so uncomfortable right now.
As you should be.
Are those truffles?
Please, go away.